You cannot run a war on jazz music, bubblegum, and the labor of housewives. That was the sentiment reverberating through the halls of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin and the Imperial Palace in Tokyo throughout 1941. To the Axis leadership, the United States was a decadent experiment nearing its collapse. Nazi propaganda ministry officials routinely mocked American society as flabby and demoralized, specifically targeting American women as symbols of a culture that prioritized comfort over conquest. They looked at the American workforce men who were jazz musicians, store clerks, and college students and laughed. They looked at the women, who were largely restricted to the domestic sphere, and assumed they were irrelevant to the brutal arithmetic of total war. Consider the world at that exact moment. By early 1942, the United States was teetering on the edge of a precipice. The Pacific Fleet was reeling from the disaster at Pearl Harbor, with only 3 aircraft carriers left to guard the entire Pacific theater. The Atlantic was a graveyard, with U-boats picking off supply ships with impunity. Britain stood alone in Europe, and the Soviet Union was fighting for its very existence in the freezing mud outside Moscow. The Axis powers were masters of the Eurasian landmass, operating on the assumption that democracy was a slow, bureaucratic, and ultimately weak system that could not mobilize for a global existential conflict before the war was already lost. The stakes were absolute. The Axis vision of the future was a world reorganized into brutal spheres of influence, defined by racial purity and absolute obedience. If the United States could not mobilize its industrial potential, if it couldn't build the planes, the tanks, and the ships, at a pace the world had never witnessed, the democratic experiment would have ended in the Pacific and the Atlantic. The Germans believed they were fighting a war of quality. They looked at their Panzers and their Messerschmitts as works of art. They were right about the engineering, but they were tragically wrong about the nature of the opponent. They expected the United States to field a gentleman's army. They didn't realize that the American industrial machine was about to be fueled by the one demographic they had completely discounted. The millions of American women who were about to prove that a factory line is just as lethal as a front line. The behind the scenes. This is where the Axis logic failed the miscalculation of the American home front. While the Nazi leadership obsessed over perfect metallurgy and hand-fitted parts, the Americans turned to the assembly line, the most powerful tool in the democratic arsenal. But this wasn't just about assembly lines. It was about who was operating them. When the men went to the front, the factories didn't slow down. They accelerated. From 1942 to 1945, the demographic composition of the American industrial workforce underwent a seismic shift. Between $5, $1, and $6, $1 million women entered the workforce, many for the first time. They didn't just take light manufacturing jobs. They became welders, riveters, electricians, and inspectors. They were the ones who ensured that the B-17 Flying Fortress wasn't just a prototype, but a ubiquitous presence in the skies over Germany. The math of annihilation. The statistics are staggering. In 1940, the U.S. produced roughly $6,000 military aircraft. By 1944, that number climbed to over $96,000 per year. Compare this to Germany. Despite Germany's focus on high-precision engineering, their peak production of aircraft never exceeded roughly $40,000 units in 1944. The production ratio favored the Allies, and specifically the United States, by a factor of nearly $10, $1 in critical categories of heavy equipment by the war's end. The Germans were building Ferraris. The Americans were building an entire fleet of industrial-grade trucks, tanks, and bombers. The Axis logic was built on the belief that a democracy would be too disorganized to sacrifice its lifestyle for war production. They underestimated the sheer, brutal capacity of the American supply chain, where raw materials were fed into a system that turned iron ore into an engine in a matter of weeks. The human element. Focus on the worker. Picture the Willow Run bomber plant, built by Ford. It was the largest assembly line in the world. It was a cathedral of industry, over a mile long. The sound wasn't the rhythmic clicking of a precision watch. It was a deafening, constant roar of rivet guns, cranes, and metal stamping. Thousands of women, the Rosies, were not merely helping. They were the pulse of the machine. They worked in 3 shifts, around the clock, in conditions that were hot, loud, and physically grueling. They learned to interpret blueprints, handle high-voltage welding equipment, and manage the complex logistics of aircraft subassemblies. The Axis leadership dismissed this as unskilled labor, but that was their primary intellectual failure. They believed that war required a specialized warrior caste. They didn't understand that by democratizing the manufacturing process, by making it possible for ordinary people, regardless of gender or previous experience, to produce the components of a B-24 Liberator, the United States had created a system that could sustain losses that would have crippled any other nation on Earth. The action. Now, look at the reality of the skies. It is 1,944. The air over occupied Europe is filled with the drone of thousands of engines. The B-17S and B-24S are flying in massive, sky-darkening formations. Listen to the sensory details. The smell of high-octane aviation fuel and ozone, the biting cold of the cockpit at $25,000 feet, the rhythmic vibration of the airframe, the sharp, concussive crack of flak bursts erupting like black blossoms around the wings. The M1 Garand on the ground, the ping of the en-bloc clip ejecting, the sheer, crushing weight of a war that was no longer fought in a single battle, but in every factory in Michigan, Ohio, and California. The German pilots, the Luftwaffe aces, were initially successful. They attacked with precision. But then, the horizon didn't clear. It just kept producing more. For every plane the Luftwaffe shot down, the American assembly lines, staffed by women working double shifts, were pushing out 2 more to replace it. The German pilot would land, exhausted, to refuel, only to see the same formation, or a larger one, appearing over the horizon the next morning. It was a psychological war of attrition, the turning point. The exact moment the Axis realized they were doomed wasn't a specific battle. It was the realization of the production disparity. Albert Speer, the German Minister of Armaments, later confessed that the German war effort was built on the assumption that they could out-engineer the West. He looked at the numbers in late 1944 and realized that Germany was not losing because of inferior tactics or bad luck. They were losing because they were being buried in a mountain of steel and aluminum. They realized that their ideology had blinded them to the reality of the 20th century battlefield, that the true, secret weapon wasn't a jet engine or a rocket. It was the industrial capacity of a mobilized free population. The legacy. The legacy of this effort is profound. By the time the war ended, the American global status was cemented not just as a military victor, but as the world's undisputed industrial hegemon. The women who entered the workforce didn't just build the planes that won the war, they fundamentally altered the social fabric of the United States. They proved that labor, skill, and strategic output were not tied to gender. The Axis mockery of American decadence had backfired completely. They had challenged a system they thought was soft, only to find that it was the most resilient, productive, and adaptable machine in human history. The war was won not just by the soldiers on the front, but by the women who ensured that for every German tank that broke down, there were $10 American replacements ready to take its place. They built the Air Force that conquered the sky, and in doing so, they changed the world FO.